John chapter 15, beginning in verse 1, I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit he prunes, to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I've spoken to you. Abide in me, as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask for whatever you wish and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another, as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants any longer, because the servant does not know what the master is doing. But I've called you friends, because I've made known to you everything that I have heard from my Father. You did not choose me, but I chose you, and I appointed you to go and bear fruit, fruit that will last, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask him in my name. I'm giving you these commandments, so that you may love one another. Now, much of what we've read here in John 15 might seem like repeat, and in some ways it is. Jesus continues to reiterate and reiterate and reiterate. Several weeks ago we talked about what love is in the Scriptures, and again, love is prominent here. In fact, the title of the message today is The Love of God. When it says God loves us, it means that he's faithful to us, that he's loyal to the things he's promised us, that he has our best interest at heart. This is the love of God. So we want to remember that as well. That's important for this passage. But Jesus is reminding us again that the reason he called his disciples out of the world, the reason that he came, was to call out beings who would be made in the image of God. It seems to me that scripturally, someone is made in the image of another person if they behave like them. And so to be made in the image of God is to reflect the character of God, the values of God, to do the kinds of things that God would do in the world, to have the kind of wisdom and rationale that God himself would have. And no one has been made in the image of God fully, except for Jesus. But through Jesus, God is calling out a people to be made in his image. This is part of what Jesus came for. Maybe the largest part of what Jesus came for. And so these last teachings on this last night of his earthly life are meant to drive the disciples toward the kind of people that he's calling them to be, and what it would really look like to say we love Jesus. And we talked about that last week. Let's look again at these first opening verses of chapter 15. Jesus says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit he prunes to make it bear more fruit. My Father's goal is to make the branches as productive as possible. And so he's working to bring great productivity from the branches. Now, when you read that, you go, okay, well, that makes sense. I imagine that anyone involved in horticulture knows that that's probably the goal. But what does it mean to bear fruit? What does it mean to be a branch that bears fruit? And how would we know if we were a branch that didn't? Getting this straight is essential. And so Jesus gives them a metaphor that's helpful, but it's not helpful just to say it. It has to be explained. What kind of fruit is he looking for? What would it look like to be productive branches? What kind of branches is the Father going to tend to make them more productive? And which branches are at risk of being cut off because they are failing to produce anything that would be of serviceable fruit for the vine dresser. So this is the metaphor, but it hasn't yet answered what fruit is. And we don't get to fill in that blank. Just like the word love, we don't get to decide what the fruit is. We don't get to decide that this fruit is working at a soup kitchen, or going to church every Sunday, or teaching my children the Lord's Prayer, or every now and again giving a bottle of water to someone living on. We don't get to fill in whatever we want the fruit to be. God defines the fruit he's looking for. The vine dresser is not interested on whether his vines are producing good pears if he's looking for grapes. So again, we want to listen to Jesus. We want to let Jesus define what good fruit is. So the question that the text begs, and Jesus hasn't yet answered exactly, is what kind of fruit is God looking for? So let's continue. Verse 3, you have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. So this seems to me to be a concern taken right out of the law of Moses. So in the law of Moses, in order to come into the tabernacle, or the temple later, in order to come into the presence of God, even though only the high priest could go all the way to the Holy of Holies, the deepest part of the temple where the Ark of the Covenant was, and the presence of God was, God promised that his presence would dwell there. Even though only the high priest could go there, everybody who entered the tabernacle, no matter how deeply they entered it, were entering into a place where God was. And so the presence of God is considered to be strong in the tabernacle. Cleanliness was important. Sickness could make you unclean. Certain kinds of behaviors could make you unclean. And if you were unclean, you could not come into the tabernacle, you could not come into the presence of God. And so Jesus sort of belays that concern by saying to them, you've already been made clean. The question is, by what? He says that they were cleansed by the word he spoke to them. Now that's an important word in the Gospel of John. The word that we translate word is the Greek word logos. And we're told in John chapter 1 verse 1, in the beginning was the word, the logos. And the logos was with God, and the logos was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were created through him. And it's the logos that becomes flesh. Jesus is the logos. He is the word of God made flesh. Logos means it's the explanation. It's the rationale for why someone does a thing that they do. So Jesus is that in the flesh. This is the function Jesus serves in some ways. He comes to explain the law. He doesn't change it, but he explains its intention. And in explaining it, he often changes the way that the people in his day thought about it. But he is the rationale, the explanation. And so Jesus has spent his entire ministry explaining the intentions of God for the things that the people of Israel had already received. He gives them the explanation. And Jesus insists here that his explanations are the source of their cleansing. We're cleansed in the new covenant of Jesus, not by bathing in a certain mixture of blood and water, not by washing our hands before we eat, which was another practice required by the law, and a good thing to do. But that's not what makes us clean before God. Jesus insists, it's my teachings and my example, the things that I have done, that I have said, that are trying to explain to you the rationale of God, where the law was pointing, what God intended from the beginning for humanity to become, what it really looks like for a person to be made in God's image and to figure forth the image of God in the world. That explanation Jesus has been giving by his example and his teaching is what cleanses us. So they don't have to worry about being unclean. They don't have to worry about not being worthy of being grafted into the vine and being a branch connected with Jesus. They've already been cleansed by his teachings, by his example. Look at verse 4. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me, and I in them, bear much fruit, because apart from me, you can do nothing. So this is part of the answer to the question, well, what fruit is God looking for? But before Jesus gets to that, he wants to assure us, first of all, you don't have to make yourself clean enough to be part of this vine and branch situation I'm talking about. You've been cleansed by my word and by my example. I have given you what you need. Secondly, this is not fruit I'm looking for you to manufacture. I'm not looking for you to work hard enough to make this fruit come about. This is fruit that will grow if you remain in me. Just as the branches don't try to produce fruit, they do produce fruit if they are sufficiently connected to the vine and they're receiving the proper nutrients. So Jesus, it's just an analogy, right? But Jesus is helping us to understand that this is not fruit we're going to work hard to produce. It's fruit that is going to be produced in us if we abide in Jesus. So we're still asking the question, what is the fruit? But at least we're getting some semblance of how this fruit is produced before we're reminded again what it looks like and how we would know whether we're producing it. But Jesus gives us a warning. If we're not producing fruit, it's not because we're not working hard enough. It's because we are not abiding in Jesus. Verse 6, whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. So Jesus is answering a question. Maybe they asked, maybe they didn't, but it's important for us to know. We started out with these branches that bear no fruit and these branches that bear much fruit. I asked the question, what's the fruit? But there's actually a better question than that, and a prior question to that. Well, why are some branches barren and other branches bearing fruit? Well, Jesus is telling us. He's answering that question now. Those who do not abide in me don't bear fruit. Those that do abide in me, they bear fruit. So the difference between the one branch and the other is that one is abiding in Jesus and one is not. So now we've got two questions. Well, what is the fruit? And what does it mean to abide in Jesus? Well, let's see if he answers it. We'll continue. Verse 7, if you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask for whatever you wish and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask for whatever you wish. So there's something about the words that Jesus has spoken, the example that he's given. The teachings of Jesus are how we abide in him. If we are abiding in Jesus, we will know that because his word will be abiding in us. His explanation, his logos, the things he's taught us, the things he's told us, they will abide in us. In many ways, Jesus is saying that his teachings, his example, these things are like the sap that runs through a vine or a tree. And so we abide in him by constantly being attentive to his example and his teachings. And if we are doing that, he gives us this great benefit. Ask my Father. You read it there in verse 7. Ask for whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. Now, we don't want to forget our context. When Jesus said that earlier, if you're failing to abide, if you're failing to hear the word of Jesus, if it's not entering your heart, if you read about Jesus and you look at the example of his life and you study his teachings and you study the scriptures and nothing is sticking, ask the Father. And he will help you. Verse 9, as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. Now we're almost ready to hear the answer to the question, what is the fruit? And how do we know if we're abiding? And all of that. But again, Jesus is reiterating that the relationship he's offering to people who follow him is directly related to the kind of relationship he had with the Father while he walked on earth. Jesus was able to produce the fruit he was able to produce because he was abiding in the Father. And now he invites us to abide in him so that we might produce the fruits he was able to produce by abiding with the Father. Jesus abided in the Father by studying the Scriptures and knowing them, and by going to the Father in prayer, and by never doing anything that the Father would not have him do, and never saying anything the Father would not have him say, letting the Father guide his life, his responses, his attitudes, his character, his behavior. This was Jesus abiding with the Father. And he's invited us to abide in him in the same way. And those who do will produce fruit. And those who are not producing fruit are not abiding in him in these ways. Are we truly in relationship with Jesus the way he was in relationship with the Father? Well, that's how fruit is produced. And if there is no fruit, then what is this? It's exposing whether we are abiding in him or in something else. Verse 9, and I know I read this, but we'll reiterate it so we can get to 10. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. Verse 10, if you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Now we're going to get into again how exactly Jesus has loved, but this is his point. How do we abide in the Father? How do we abide in Jesus? We abide in him by obeying his teachings, by living the life that he's asked us to live, by his example, and by following the instructions he gives. This is how we abide in him. Now, with the question of what fruit is produced is still there. You and I might be led to believe that the obedience itself is the fruit he's talking about, but that's not it yet. The obedience is the abiding. Did you read it? If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love. Abiding in Jesus is about obeying him. Just as Jesus was abiding in the Father by obeying the Father. We've read these verses in John throughout our time in it. Jesus says, I never say anything the Father didn't tell me to say. I never do anything the Father didn't tell me to do. That was Jesus abiding with the Father. And if we are to produce fruits, we have to abide in him by obeying him. It's strange, right? Well, if the fruit isn't obedience, then what is the fruit that obedience bears? And that's the question. And we have to listen for that. That's difficult. But here we go. This is my commandment, that you will love one another as I have loved you. Verse 13, no one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants any longer, because the servant does not know what the master is doing. But I've called you friends, because I've made known to you everything that I've heard from my Father. You did not choose me, but I chose you, and I appointed you to go and bear fruit, fruit that will last, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask him in my name. I'm giving you these commands so that you may love one another. So Jesus is the vine, we are the branches. If we abide in him, if we remain in him, we will produce fruit. And we remain in him by obeying what he said, by following his example, by being the kind of people in our day that he described in his day. This is how we abide in him. And he promises, if we abide in him in this way, we can ask God for anything and he will give it. And again, that's related to our obedience and to the will of God in the world, not just to anything we want, but that won't be a concern if we're abiding in him and obeying his commandments. Our requests will be in line with who Jesus is. And God will hear us. But did you hear what the fruit was? What fruit is produced by this relationship? This relationship in which we attend to the teachings of Jesus. We obey him. We follow him. We see his example and recognize it's the right way to live. We listen to his teachings when he tells us to love our enemies, to pray for those who persecute us, to give to those who are in need. When he tells us to be humble and not proud, to take the last seat at the table and never the first, when he tells us that the greatest among us must be a servant, and that anyone who wants to exalt themselves will be humbled. These are all teachings of Jesus. When he tells us not to worry about the future, but to do the good that's before us each day and never allow our fear of what we might eat or what we might wear lead us into sin or into rebellion against God, but always to trust God with the consequences of our obedience. When Jesus teaches us all these things, living like this is true is abiding with him. And did you see the fruit that's produced? A person who would lay down their life for another. A person who has not only offered the opportunity to become a slave, a servant of God, but a friend of God. This is the fruit. And Jesus wants them to bear much fruit. He wants them to have the kind of relationship with him and the Father that he enjoys with the Father. He wants there to be intimacy of relationship. And he wants, through obedience to him, a character to be shaped that will spontaneously do the most godly acts in the most ungodly of times. This is the fruit. Jesus' teachings don't cover every circumstance. There will be things that we will face in the world that Jesus did not specifically address. But if we remain in him and we attend to what he has told us and we shape our lives by his teachings and his explanation of the law of Moses and the prophets, if we do that and remain in him, he will produce fruits in us that will be consistent with him even in areas that he has not specifically guided us yet. We will begin to interact with the world and with others the way Jesus did. This is the promise. Well, what does that mean for us? Well, for Jesus it means loving each other the way he loved his disciples. He washed their feet and he died for them. And his teachings go deeper than just loving your friends. He encourages us to love our enemies and those who persecute us in the same ways.